Greetings. Thank you very much for coming to this latest talk in the Talking Animals series. My name is Sean Butler. I'm co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law, and I'm hosting today's event because my co-director Raffael is the subject of it, and it would be unfair to get him to do both. Right. So the structure of today. I'll introduce Raffael and our three respondents, and then we'll open it up for questions as usual, and we'll have a hard finish at 6:30 p.m. UK time. So the meeting is going to be recorded. The presentations are going to be recorded. So Raffael and the three respondents will be recorded. When we get to the question and answer bit, which is open to all, we will stop the recording. If you would like to make a comment, please raise your little yellow hand, your electronic hand, so I can see that. If you prefer not to ask your question or make your comment in person, then you're very welcome to just write a comment in the sidebar and I will ask it for you. I think that's all we need to do. So let's start. I have to say, just to begin, it's a great pleasure introducing Raffael. His book is outstanding, and so really enjoyed reading it, and I think it should be a very interesting talk today. So let me introduce Raffael and the three people who are going to be making comments on it. So Raffael is the Yates Glazebrook Fellow and College Assistant Professor in Law at Jesus College here at Cambridge. He's an affiliated lecturer at the Cambridge Law Faculty, and as I said, he's co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law with me. He was previously Fellow in Law at the London School of Economics, and he obtained his PhD in Law from the University of Cambridge. He holds an LLM from Yale Law School, an MA in Philosophy from University College London, and a Bachelor and a Master of Law from the University of Freiburg. He's co-author of Animal Rights Law, published by Hart last year with me, and this book that we're about to discuss today. Our three respondents, we're delighted and very grateful to you all for giving up your time in this talk and discussion. So we have Manisha Decker, Justin Marceau, and Joe Wills. So Manisha is Professor and Lansdowne Chair in Law at the University of Victoria. Her research interests include animal legal studies, critical animal studies, feminist animal care theory, and feminist analysis of law, socio-legal studies in general, and reproductive and end-of-life ethics. Her book, entitled Animals as Legal Beings, Contesting Anthropocentric Legal Orders, was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2021. Justin Marceau is Professor and Brooks Institute Faculty Research Scholar of Animal Law and Policy at Stern College of Law at the University of Denver. His research is focused on criminal law, civil rights, and animal. He's the author of more than 40 academic articles and essays and 2 textbooks. His first book, Beyond Cages, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, and his second book was an edited volume with Laurie Gruen titled Castle Logics. And his most recent book was co-authored with Alan Chen and is entitled Truth and Transparency. Joe Wills is a lecturer in law at the University of Leicester here in the UK. His research institutes are principally in the field of animal rights and human rights, and he's the recipient of a Leverhulme Trust Research Fellowship for a monograph on the topic, The Legal Status of Non-Human Animals in Britain, a Social Relations Perspective. And his publications include the book Contesting World Order, Socioeconomic Rights and Global Justice Movements, and that's published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. So, having introduced our speaker and our colleagues who are providing comments, Raffael, I'd like to invite you to introduce your book, and please.
Thank you very much, Sean, for the very kind introduction, and thanks all for being here. It's a real pleasure to be able to launch my PhD book with you all in the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. Sounds like a really amazing talk series, so it's a real pleasure to be here. So I'd like to start by telling you a bit more about the context and the reason I wrote this book and what's it really all about. The starting point are the litigation efforts that we have been seeing in quite many countries now to have non-human animals recognized as holders of legal rights or legal personhood, and the corresponding legislative efforts that, again, have sort of happened in quite a few countries now with animal rights proponents trying to secure some fundamental rights for animals. Take one example here from my home country of Switzerland, where, as some of you may know, there was a citizens' initiative that proposed to amend the constitution of the canton, that is the state of Basel City, so as to provide not just for human rights, but also for fundamental rights for some non-human animals. Specifically, the initiative asked for there to be a right to life and a right to bodily and mental integrity for non-human primates. The animal rights proponents behind this initiative, and I was one of the drafters of the initiative, saw this as an important symbolic step forward for animal rights and for extending fundamental rights beyond the human species. But that's exactly what some people found problematic and why there has been some pushback against the Primate Rights Initiative. Specifically, the cantonal executive has advised citizens, or did advise citizens, against voting for the initiative. The executive usually issues such guidance in the run-up to initiatives, and here it came out against the Primate Rights Initiative. And this is what they wrote. It said that if fundamental rights were also granted to non-human primates, this would blur the line between humans and animals, and our fundamental and human rights would be watered down and relativized. And this worry is representative of a broader concern that some have voiced, including a lot of human rights proponents have voiced against animal rights, that they would water down human rights. So the question really that my book asks is whether it is possible to extend fundamental legal rights or legal personhood or other legal entitlements to animals without jeopardizing human rights. And my book tackles this question in three parts: a historic part, a conceptual part, and a practical part. So I'll start by telling you more about the historic part of the book. In the first chapter, I conduct an intellectual history, and I begin with the sort of commonplace view that the modern animal rights idea has its roots in the sort of late 19th, but really the 20th century, and specifically the late 20th century with writings such as, Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, Tom Regan, and others. And what I show in my book is that, in fact, the modern idea of animal rights goes back to at least the 18th century, specifically the French Enlightenment. And that's quite a striking finding, or it was a striking finding for me at least, because as some of you may know, this is also the time when human rights are believed to have emerged. So, the American and French revolutions, really, this is when we're seeing a sort of ideas of the rights of man being formulated in the way that we recognize it still today. So I find it quite striking, and I try to sort of show this, that and the idea of human rights emerged at the same time as the idea of animal rights. And not just that, they didn't just emerge at the same time. I also propose that they emerged in tandem or in conversation with one another. And I draw out this this finding by looking at the debate between two French Enlightenment thinkers. Jean-Claude de la Mettrie on the one hand, here to your left, his main work, and Jean-Baptiste Salaville, his sort of key text for us on the right. So who was Jean-Claude de la Mettrie? He was an advocate or a proponent of an important view at the time, a way of thinking which I call naturalism, which was very much influenced by the empirical spirit at the time. And he took the view, as did other naturalists, that humans exist on a continuum of matter where they exist with other creatures, and there are no sort of strict, clear separations between humans and other particles of matter, really. And de la Mettrie proposed strikingly that because, like humans, animals are sentient creatures, they should have three rights: a right to life, a right to health, and a right to plaisir or enjoyments. Salaville, the person to your right here, was not happy with this idea at all, because his writings were representative of another stream of thinking that surfaced at the time, which I call egalitarianism. According to this view, humans aren't on a continuum with other animals, but they are separate from all non-human animals. And in fact, they're entirely sort of distinct type of being, and they're all equal, at least in principle. And Salaville came out strongly against this notion that non-human animals should have fundamental rights, because he too, like the cantonal executive that we talked about earlier, thought that this would undermine human rights if we were to grant rights to animals. Now, this brings me to the conceptual part of the book, because as I try to show in the second half of the book, the two conceptions, de la Mettrie's and Salaville's, they are representative of two ideal, typical, archetypical ways of thinking about fundamental rights that aren't just an 18th century thing, but they're still relevant for us today. They're still representative of how human rights thinkers think about human rights and how animal rights thinkers think about animal rights. So let me start with what I call the aristocratic conception, which is the ideal type that I think is prevalent in human rights thinking today, and that is inspired, albeit unwittingly, by the Salavillian way of thinking. Jeremy Waldron, I believe, has captured this aristocratic character of contemporary human rights practice and thinking particularly well when talking about human rights and human dignity as aristocratic notions. So he's telling us that there's something similar going on in human rights today as, you know, there was with noble people and their privileges, because like noble people, human beings today have a high and equal rank, the rank of dignity that makes us special. And this idea really follows the egalitarian stream of thinking, as I alluded to, in that all humans are seen as equal, at least in principle, and all non-humans are excluded from this, are viewed as a wholly separate type of creature. The aristocratic conception I propose in the book has two main elements. The first one is what I call equal consideration, and the three distinguishing features of that element are nicely captured in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which tells us that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The first element here is a hereditary element. We are born into the status of human dignity and into our rights, just as noble people will be born into their noble rank and their noble privileges. It is also an equal rank, right? All humans have this rank equally. And then lastly, it's about all human beings, right? It excludes all non-human beings. So these are the three defining features of the conception. How do aristocrats explain these features? They adopt what I call an internalist account. Roughly, Internalism refuses to ground human dignity or human rights in empirical features of human beings. So the idea is we don't have dignity and we don't have rights because we are particularly intelligent or because we're autonomous. The aristocratic conception doesn't ground rights and status in those empirical properties, in human nature in the first place. Rather, it starts from normative assumptions, maybe a decision that we should all be equal, or a story that we're telling that only humans are special. Why is there this internalist approach? I think Anne Phillips, political theorist based at LSE, has put this really neatly when she says that if we link the entitlement to human rights to characteristics like vulnerability to pain or capacity for conscious planning, then the empirical evidence may well lead to the conclusion that some of the great apes qualify for at least some of the so-called human rights. But, and that's a big but here, it may also lead to the conclusion that some humans who currently qualify, for instance, day-old infants who have not yet developed consciousness, those in a coma who've lost it, they are not entitled. So in other words, if we ground equality, rights, dignity in human nature, then we're going to have a problem if there's some human beings whose nature isn't quite up to scratch. They're not conscious enough. They are maybe less conscious than others, have lost consciousness. That will get them into trouble. They may not then qualify, deserve human dignity or human rights. So what's the strength of the aristocratic conception? It is that it does not make dignity, rights, equality subject to such empirical refutation. You cannot say, I found a human being who lacks, say, an interest in future existence and therefore doesn't deserve the right to life. You cannot even do that because the right to life is not grounded in such empirical features. But there's a flip side to this strength, which is its weakness, namely, by refusing to look at nature, if you will, at what the empirical world is actually like, aristocrats are in danger of creating concepts that are really arbitrary and that don't map onto reality anymore, and that arbitrarily exclude some from the protection of rights, for instance. This brings me to the meritocratic conception, which is on the opposite end of the spectrum. Really, it's antithetical to the aristocratic conception, and we'll see why in a second. Just like the aristocratic conception is, I think, a dominant one in human rights scholarship, so is the meritocratic conception in animal rights scholarship. So if you're an animal rights proponent, you may hopefully recognize some of these elements in some of your thinking. This conception is influenced by a naturalist way of looking at things, much as we saw in de la Mettrie's writings. The meritocratic conception has two elements that mirror the elements of the aristocracy. That's why I'm saying they're antithetical. So instead of equal consideration, we have what I call differential consideration. So first, meritocrats reject the idea of heredity, as I call it. What they think matters is an individual's merit. So does an individual have the relevant features? Is the chimpanzee sentient, for instance? Do they have an interest in future existence? If so, they should have, prima facie at least, a right to life. It does not matter which species they are born into, right? So you do away with this group-based criterion. Secondly, you move away from equality, really, because once you ground rights and status in empirical features, you are or must be open to these features being more present in some beings than in others. So what if maybe you encounter an animal that doesn't have an interest in future existence? Well, then prima facie doesn't deserve the right to life, if that's the grounding interest for that right. Or you have a being that has the interest to a lesser extent, then the being would deserve that right to a lesser extent. You're abandoning the idea of equality here, and you're introducing a sort of stratified way of looking things, a potential hierarchy. And then lastly, more positively now, because you're just looking at an individual's possession of relevant features, you can include beings that aren't, members of the species Homo sapiens. You're now on a much more inclusive trajectory. How do meritocrats explain these elements of their theory? They reject internalism and adopt externalism, as I call it. So here we very much have a grounding process that's happening. We ground, animal rights proponents ground animals' rights in features, empirical features. They point to the science. Look, science is now showing that maybe insects are sentient. And that means we can ground their status, their rights in that sentience, which we have objectively identified and shown. The meritocratic conception has a real strength. And that strength, in my view, lies in its being able to provide a solid foundation for fundamental rights and other legal protections. As I just said, you can point to the features that individuals have. Scientists, their studies showing us X and Y. You can point to this. This is much less arbitrary, in my view, than a decision that we think, it's important to treat species X in a particular way. So that's a real strength. But there's a corresponding weakness, and it's again just the flip side of the strength. Once you start to look at human nature or animal nature, you are at risk of introducing hierarchies of rights holders. As I suggested, if there's potentially one human that has an interest to future existence to a stronger degree than another human with an interest in future existence, and the former, would potentially deserve the right to life to a higher degree. Or maybe there's a human who doesn't have that interest at all. Doesn't that endanger particularly vulnerable human beings? I think it does. And this brings me to the last part of the book, the practical part. So, as I suggested, the aristocratic and meritocratic conceptions, they are really on a spectrum and they are antithetical to one another. Really, the advantages of one are the disadvantages of the other and vice versa. And because of that, I propose that the best way forward is a practical middle ground between these two archetypes. And as I show in the book, and I think I will need sort of explaining in this group, legal systems are currently very much aristocratic, right? They're very much on the aristocratic end of the spectrum. They only give rights to, or for the most part, only give rights to human beings. So what I propose is that we need to meritocratize the aristocracy. We need to move in the direction of the meritocracy to reach that middle ground. And in the book, I explore two options. I'm just going to mention these here, and I'm happy to go into more detail in the Q&A if there's interest. First option is undoing the property status of non-human animals. So this could range from, turning them into something like living property, as David Faber has proposed, or really granting animals legal personhood, either of a sort of sui generis nature or of the same sort that, say, humans have. Another option I look into is expanding, a range of fundamental legal rights to animals. We already talked about right to life, right to bodily mental integrity. We could be looking at right to family life potentially too. Now, lastly, and this is another, I hope, contribution of the book, I want to show that to avoid overshooting the mark and maybe going too far in the meritocratic direction, it is important to salvage some of the aristocratic ideas that I think are really a sort of a good thing to have and a strength. And what I sort of start off from is this orthodox view that I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, that it is speciesist to give rights and legal personhood to animals on the basis of their species. That's problematic, as Richard Ryder, Peter Singer, and many others have told us. I think compellingly in the domain of moral philosophy. But what I try to say in the book is that law has to operate at least somewhat differently to moral philosophy. And in law, we may have good reason for using a group-based criterion like species membership. We don't just, shouldn't sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater, because there's actually some real use to group-based criteria. And so the species membership approach says the following. It says, fundamental rights incognate legal entitlements, right? So my focus is exclusively on legal entitlements. They should be given to non-human animals on the basis of their species, not their individual capacities. Why do I think this is a potentially good idea? First, I think it's quite pragmatic. If you are a judge, you're not a zoologist. Most likely you're not going to be a zoologist. If you get a case that asks you to assess the individual properties of an animal, is that given chimpanzee autonomous, yes or no? You're not really competent to address that question. However, you are most likely going to have access to studies telling you something about the mental capacities of chimpanzees as a species, and you can rely on that if you're following the species membership approach. It will also save you time to be able to just use those studies rather than be looking into individuals. And secondly, and just as importantly, I think it's politically useful for two reasons. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, for pragmatic reasons too, realistic, practical reasons, it helps us to preserve that egalitarian element that is vital to human rights thinking and certainly has been vital in sort of post-World War II human rights thinking, this idea that all humans are born equal. We saw it early in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it preserves that egalitarian element. But secondly, it does that whilst still allowing for extensions of rights and legal personhood and other entitlements to non-human animals. That just has to happen on the basis of species rather than individual capacities. Okay, just to wrap up, what does this tell us about the Primate Rights Initiative? Was the cantonal executive right to be concerned that this would relativize human rights? I don't think they were right to be worried about this. As I suggested, the Primate Rights Initiative would have extended rights to all non-human primates. So it didn't exactly use the criterion of species here, but it did use a group-based criterion, essentially, sets of species, all species belonging to, the group of non-human primates or primates for that matter. And in doing that, I think it would not have endangered vulnerable human beings because it would not have focused on individual capacities and properties. Now, I grant that there are other potential concerns. How do we divide, scarce resources? How do we resolve conflicts between human rights and animal rights? So these matters will need to be tackled separately, but at least on the front of endangering human beings on the grounds of, sort of relativizing them, introducing hierarchies, I don't think the species membership is vulnerable to that, and nor would the Primate Initiative have been. Okay, so I very much look forward to hearing from our excellent respondents now and to your questions and comments later on. So thank you for that.
Raphael, thank you very much. So I'd like to invite Manisha Decker to comment on your book and your presentation.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you so much, Raffael. It's such a pleasure to be invited to comment on this wonderful book, and I'm so very pleased to be here with everyone. I want to start off in my time just to share my really steadfast view that Raffael's book is a gift to almost every reader who encounters it. Just let me say 3 reasons why. First, for readers who appreciate clear and methodical analysis in the form of meticulous presentation of a carefully organized and innovatively organized argument, they will be really well rewarded. I myself like this type of writing, and it was such a pleasure to be taken through the analysis step by compelling step. Second, I think the book is a gift for readers who are new to the field of animal law and who'd like a crisp yet nuanced overview of the reigning arguments and debates. And perhaps most importantly, third, readers, and I count myself in this group too, who are quite well versed in animal law and animal rights and animal ethics literature already, are gifted a new intervention into and framing of long-standing issues, most prominently perhaps in the showcasing of French thinkers that Raphael just explained, and their connection to current debates tracking the aristocratic and meritocratic history that are now prominent still. But I also really appreciated the other innovative interventions, Raffael, that you made in terms of discussing why legal advocacy must depart from moral philosophy, and also the need to tolerate some level of arbitrariness in legal metrics and proofs. And I really liked how you flagged some of the critical disability studies arguments regarding the need for continued human-based aristocracy, and how you integrated those concerns into your argument. So I really believe, taking all these features together, Raffael has given us a book that provides an intriguing historical account and a contemporary nutshell analysis of debates today. Also a practical and immensely well-defended roadmap of how to move forward in our advocacy, all written in a style that deserves to be emulated by any scholar in any field. This is really an accomplishment to celebrate. Let me say a few points of the reflections I have where I might press the analysis further. First, I wonder if the problem of species avoidance that the species membership approach is meant to rectify vis-a-vis the meritocracy is overdetermined somewhat, or misses what the author cited have really been concerned about. I was quite struck by the interpretation of Singer and Francione and others, because my readings of their arguments and some of the quoted lines from their influential works about the illegitimacy of species as a criterion is that what they're really saying is that it's illegitimate to elevate one species over another, such that human exceptionalism is wrong, not deciding a matter according to species. Similarly, this is also my reading of feminist animal care or ecofeminist approaches. That is not to take an individualist view of who counts, but simply to include more than human species. So I want to be provocative here to suggest that perhaps the species membership approach actually aligns with the orthodox view on that score about how to think about species in the meritocracy. Second, I understand the practical impulses for the middle ground, Raffael, that you've charted. I can't but worry that the acceptance of excluding what are invariably going to be seen as lower animals and other non-humans, as you go over so helpfully in terms of trying to operationalize the approach SMA, that perhaps it also cannot be defended today by the terms you've discussed, in that doing so, keeping a hierarchy amongst species and animals, is perhaps also not connected to our current reality. So just the same way that we might say the human aristocratic approach is not connected to current realities, given what we know about animals, we might say also that keeping a middle ground that is still tethered to the aristocratic approach is disconnected. So here I'm thinking of critiques that ask us to, really go back to thinking about the rights of nature, or the nature needs have movement, or scholars who have talked about, for example, political philosopher Jim Tully, about the need for law to become more reflective of kind of Gaia principles and actually be called Gaia law. Not so much because we know more about the intelligence or sentience or emotional lives of animals, but because we know how interconnected the fates of humans are with all life on this planet, right? And every day we're confronted with new statistics, very devastating and sobering, asking us to take drastic action. So to address things like climate change and other perils, while heeding the disability and feminist disability concerns, especially about care and mutual support for those who are particularly, let's say, connected and interdependent, perhaps we might look more to norms of reciprocity, relationality, intimacy, kinship, or as some have suggested, affect, symbiosis. These types of kind of concepts and values are quite different from the ones that the book discusses. And perhaps, arise more quickly when we don't start with what is arguably a more Western philosophical starting point. So I suggest that as kind of another provocation to think about what might be a better starting point to get to perhaps a more realistic global reality middle ground. And finally, quickly, I just want to press further on the issue of what may be practical. In my own work, I've suggested that human rights and animal rights is actually not a zero-sum game, as the kind of respect for the aristocratic view would suggest that it is. So I see the work of other critical disability scholars, critical animal studies scholars working on race, gender, and all elements of intersectionality as also suggesting it's not a zero-sum game. For the reasons that many of us might have come across in our literature reviews, that we cannot really understand kind of what the aristocrats are worried about in terms of inegalitarianism among humans without attending to kind of the trope of animality and how animals are treated. So the initial separation seems to be misguided. So that leads me to wonder if we really need a middle ground that keeps the aristocracy alive at some level, or not. Of course, there are no easy answers to all of this. And here I really do agree, Raffael, with what you were saying at the end about we're invariably led back to capacities that invariably are going to need some type of line drawing. So how to make inroads and make them fast is a huge, huge question. I'll just leave with the thought that perhaps if you come to an approach that perhaps is like more of what I've argued in my book, embodied vulnerability, or what others have talked about, interspecies interdependence, that it will always entail fewer and weaker rights for those with fewer and weaker interests, that we might have a different framing of how we see what is weak and what is fewer, than what seems to be the presumption in the book, that we will always be stuck with this dilemma if we have any type of differential consideration. So there's something to consider at the end. Thank you again. I'm really grateful for you for sparking such a wonderful capsule conversation in a relatively short book about the best way to make change for animals and make it quickly. Thank you, everyone.
Manisha, thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to invite Justin Marceau to comment on the book and presentation.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Sean. Congratulations, Raffael. It's a terrific book and one that I think is equal parts original and careful for the reasons that Manisha said. And it's always a danger to go after Manisha because she is, as advertised, very careful and methodical. So, you know, I will be a bit derivative, but thank you also, Raffael, for the really wonderful overview of this book. I don't know if everyone in the audience who hasn't had a chance to read it yet understand how closely you engage with the arguments from groups like the Non-Human Rights Project and others, and it's a very fascinating read. So I want to note at the outset that I'm going to take if it's okay, Raffael, especially after Manisha's comments, I'm going to take a largely celebratory tone, which isn't my normal tone in if you know my academic style, but I really do want to sort of be more celebratory in the things that I liked here. I will say that at the outset, kind of one of the things that struck me is that this book is a really deep dive into philosophical thought, some that I hadn't even read, and yet Raffael manages to keep it practical the whole time, with lots of sort of road mapping and as Manisha promised, sort of like this kind of methodical approach building to the thesis. I think if you were to look at the table of contents, as I did when I first got the book, it's not exactly an amuse-bouche for the readers, Raffael. You know, I mean, you have this sort of like, okay, here's the Enlightenment, then we've got the aristocracy, then we've got the meritocracy, then the meritocracy meets the aristocracy, and it reads a little bit like it's going to be a lot of jargon. And the payoff doesn't come until chapter 7. So when I first looked at the table of contents, I was a bit I'm not sure, shaken. But I have to say that's not at all how the book reads, because you tie it all together so masterfully, and in between, with examples of rats exposed to toxic spills that are sort of smarter than humans and the like. So I think you really kind of under promise and over deliver, which is a good station to be in, and I enjoyed it. Among the questions that I thought the book engaged with for me that were helpful were things that have nagged me, including how does the animal rights movement engage with human rights frameworks? And of course, other scholars have taken this up, but I think some of the work you do here is much more comprehensive and really quite thoughtful. It is a gift to the field. I think that the way that you approach this project in asking how scientific discovery, particularly from the natural sciences, should be relevant to the field of animal law is really helpful, and it's timely as we see these reports coming out about cephalopods and other beings. I think that the sort of the nod to you want science to be relevant and that you have an idea for how to do so, I found really refreshing. I also think that the taxonomy that you provide of just thinking about um, pre-existing thought in the field was helpful for me. I kind of have a mental flow chart of the way I go through the thinkers, and this challenged some of that even. I do think that the point about whether what Francione and Singer and many others have said about speciesism is a fair point, in that what they're trying to do is avoid human exceptionalism. And I won't belabor that point, because I think Manisha made a good summary of what I think. But I do worry that at times the book looks a little bit like it's framing it as they don't want us to look at species generalized information, when really what they're concerned about is probably something like human exceptionalism. And then the other thing that I thought was a great contribution, as Manisha noted, is that in the final chapters, you really do, I think, in an interesting way, engage with the role of moral philosophy in law. And having just read Martha Nussbaum's book and others, you have a quite different approach to this. And I thought it was challenging, but I thought it was also really interesting. I tend to personally think of philosophy as providing the theoretical account upon which we might pursue certain legal reforms. And you're much more, especially given your philosophical chops, you're much more willing to set that aside for what you view as feasibility, what you view as practicality. I thought that was fascinating. I mean, on another over a drink or something, I'll push you a bit harder on these, even the economics of it. You say, well, for economic purposes, but it's quite interesting to see someone who's so deeply engaged with the philosophical literature say, look, I'm going to sort of make a nod to this, what I view as practical. In terms of the setup and the framework for the book, I really liked the divide that I mocked in the table of contents. I thought it worked well, because your ultimate question, you say on the very first page of your book, and that's where you had me, is that this is a book about, quote, how facts about the nature of an animal should induce change in law. And I was reading with great interest after that, and it's so readable. And I don't want to reiterate the great summary you already did, but for me, it was really helpful to think about these two competing paradigms. On the one, right, for the people who haven't read the book, this idea that the post-World War II human rights framework has the virtue of being egalitarian, but the vice of sort of propping up egalitarianism for humans by minimizing or reducing animals, I think is accurate and really well done. We do, right? I mean, even in events that I've held with civil rights lawyers, we deploy language throughout our briefs, throughout our conversations, throughout law review articles. I was just pulling up law review articles this morning on solitary confinement, where we say things like, we wouldn't treat a dog this way, or this prisoner was acting like an animal. These types of things. And you have this great line on page 60 where you say, quote, the relationship tends to be an inversely proportional one. The more one lifts humanity's status and praises its dignity, the more one lowers the status of others. And I think that's quite right. The point here that the human rights framework is rhetorically benefited when it sort of others animals, sort of says, well, we're special, we're humans, is something I think many of us who do animal work accept, but you really challenged me to think about that more deeply. And then, of course, you say, But if we're going to change, or we're going to start looking at empirical realities, and we should look at empirical realities because the conception that humans and only humans have these special traits is bordering on farcical, then we get close to a slippery slope. And you tell us that that slippery slope is particularly steep for all the concerns regarding race and disability and other things that have been properly documented through the book. And I think that this tension is a good one, and it drives your reader really naturally to your conclusion in ways that I thought persuaded me much more than having just read the textbook by you and Sean. So I think that that's wonderful. I also confess that, as a big fan of much of the work of the Non-Human Rights Project, one of the things that always made me a little uncomfortable are the sort of responses in the briefing to Richard Cupp type arguments, right? So when you read a Non-Human Rights Project brief, it often says things like, Happy the elephant has these amazing capacities, and then cites all of the science, and then says, therefore she's entitled to rights. But to avoid sort of offending Richard Cupp and the human rights people, we often see some language, and I was pulling some out, something like, but, quote, these conditions are sufficient but not necessary, right? So I think the Non-Human Rights Project has done this exactly as you said. And on the one hand, I appreciate that move because it's a response to the critiques you've been making. But my simplistic mind always found this troubling. It's sort of the, oh no, autonomy, self-determination is sufficient for elephants, but it's not necessary for humans. Then I was always thinking about, well, haven't we just perpetuated a speciesist framework? We prop up humans by saying they are special, even when they don't have certain traits. And that's troubled me on many occasions. But then Raffael comes along and says, as he did today, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's perfectly fine. In fact, this is what the species membership approach calls for. And so I think that the way that your logic and reasoning lines up with the arguments that are quite practical that Steve Wise and the Non-Human Rights Project have been making is great. And it adds a real level of intellectual heft to I think what they have been doing in large measure. So thank you for that. I won't go through the questions. I think I'm out of time, but maybe I'll just pose one additional thought or question. I think, as I mentioned, I had a lot of challenges in the final section, and I would love to see your follow-up book or project on this sort of feasibility analysis. In one measure, I agree with Manisha that there's not as much of a zero-sum game as these chapters apply, but then the efforts like you've seen in your own country suggest that sometimes that's how it's pitted, so we need a response. I thought it was interesting that when you got to sort of laying out how the species membership approach would work in practice and why it was okay to look at species, you led with feasibility, and you did so with two reasons that don't have much moral force at all. After all of this moral hand-wringing, we get to the first two feasibility explanations are judicial economy, which I never find judicial economy persuasive for anything. And so you start with judicial economy, and then the second was sort of related, efficiency. You said judges will have a hard time analyzing the attributes or natural abilities of individual animals before them. And this is an interesting point because it's both correct, and we could talk about it a lot, but in many cases, we do want courts to look at the individual attributes of animals, and we expect them to. And I could go through lots of cases. We do this in sort of doggy death penalty cases where euthanasia is at stake. We do it in civil rights cases quite often when, the police farm or kill a dog. We might say the state's response is often to say, well, here are the general characteristics of this breed. This is a dangerous dog. This is the kind of dog who attacks without notice. And the response of the lawyers is to say, well, no, but this individual animal. And the courts are in the throes of having to make individual determinations. And I think this comes up more often than you think. And I don't know that courts are particularly bad at it because we have lawyers who are particularly good at bringing in evidence about animals. So the feasibility stuff, comes after all this moral force that is, and it leaves me a little bit, just a tiny bit, wanting, because I do think we do it. Now, I think your response might be, it's kind of a one-way ratchet in that you're looking for species evidence that can raise the status of animals, and we don't need to be looking at, and you aren't necessarily opposed to looking at individual characteristics if it would result in harm to the animal. But that undercuts some of the feasibility analysis you've done, and raises questions that I think Manisha made about why are we playing around with species if in fact it's really human exceptionalism that we're concerned about. But I will close there, and thank you so much, Raffael. Thanks for writing this. The work that you put in is obvious, and we're all grateful for reading it. It's a great read. Thank you so much.
Justin, thank you very much indeed. I'll now invite Joe to make the third presentation. Joe.
Thank you. So it's a real honor to be a discussant for this outstanding book by Raffael, and I just want to reiterate what Manisha and Justin have already said. It's really a wonderful book, an instant classic, I'd argue, in the field of animal law, one of the best written and most analytically rigorous works of its kind yet. And as already been said, it works on so many levels. It's incredibly illuminating as a piece of intellectual history. It's really rich as a philosophical inquiry, and most importantly of all, it's really a pragmatic proposal for political and legal reform for extending rights to non-human animals. And yet, despite the complexity of the ideas grappled with, the book is highly engaging and accessible in the way it's written. And in fact, when one looks at the endorsements on the back, they're quite unusual for an academic book. They describe it as, quote, a page turner, thrilling and fascinating. And I really don't think these are descriptors that can be given in good faith for most academic monographs, but they are entirely appropriate for Raffael's book. It's wonderful. I really can't recommend it enough, and I think everyone interested in this topic really needs to get a copy. But I think we've probably had a long enough love-in now, and so I will, just for the remainder of my talk, give some critical-ish comments, I suppose. Okay, so we've heard at this book launch that Raffael defends what he calls the species membership approach, which argues for extending fundamental rights to other animals, not on the basis of those animals' individual capacities, but rather on the basis, I suppose, of the general capacities of the species that they belong to. And Raffael presents this as a sort of Aristotelian golden mean between the aristocratic and meritocratic approaches, or perhaps a sort of Hegelian synthesis of the two to try and retain the benefits of each and reduce the weaknesses of each as well. And it has this advantage, right, of, on the one hand, protecting the equal moral status and legal status of human beings, whilst also extending the circle of fundamental rights to other deserving species. Now, within this framework, Raffael views the aristocratic and meritocratic approaches as antipodal or antithetical to each other, right? But I think he describes them in the book as negative images of one another. The benefits of one are the weaknesses of the other, and vice versa. Yeah, so what I want to try and suggest is that there might be an alternative way of conceptualizing the relationship between these approaches. Rather than seeing them as antipodal, one could also see these approaches as, in some senses, overlapping. In other words, sharing certain features and accordingly sharing similar strengths and weaknesses to one another. And to explore that alternative way of looking at the relationship between these two approaches, I'd like to consider a central issue in the book, which is the relationship between rational capacities and rights possession. Now, Raffael, in my view, correctly identifies the dangers of reinforcing hierarchies between humans within certain variants of the meritocratic approach, right? And that's because the meritocratic approach grounds possession of fundamental rights on individual capacities, which of course vary amongst the human species. And there are going to be some variants of the meritocratic approach, which Raffael documents, that suggest that some humans who fall below some threshold of rationality may lack fundamental rights altogether, or in some sense might matter less. And of course, this is a form of ableism, and has already been discussed by in this session. There are often gendered, racialized, and class-based dimensions to these notions of rationality, and plenty of reasons why defenders of egalitarianism might be worried. However, what Raffael assumes is that the aristocratic approach avoids these problems, at least in its ideal form. Right? But there's this whole body of work, right, broadly under the umbrella of critical animal studies that would contest that, right? So this would include authors like Manisha Decker, but also Will Kimlicka and Sonora Taylor, Claire Jean Kim and Af Ko, who have argued all, paradoxically, that drawing a hard line between humans and the other animals when it comes to moral and legal status actually helps to reinforce certain forms of hierarchy, even within the human species, whether that's related to gender or race or disability. And indeed, this isn't merely a theoretical claim, right? There's a whole bunch of empirical literature in the domain of social psychology that's at least consistent with these claims, right? That people who draw sharp divides between humans and other animals have certain discriminatory attitudes to members of human outgroups, or are more likely to have those attitudes. Now, I don't have time to fully expound on the nature of these arguments here, but what I want to focus on is maybe what is somewhat overlooked in the book, which is what unites the aristocratic and meritocratic approaches, or at least these approaches as articulated by some of the predominant thinkers identified in Raphael's book. And I think the overlap is that the two approaches in various ways valorize certain conceptions of rationality. So let's take meritocrats or identified meritocrats like Peter Singer and Jeff McMahon, for example. They are well known for drawing moral distinctions between what they call persons on the one hand and merely sentient beings on the other, right? And the dividing line between these groups is whether or not they possess certain rational capacities. On the other side, though, when we look at aristocrats like Jeremy Waldron or James Griffin or Ronald Dworkin, they're all pretty clear in their work that the reason humans have this high and equal moral status relates to our allegedly unique capacities as a species, again, linking back to some conception of rationality. And so I think the key difference between these aristocratic and meritocratic thinkers is that the meritocrat grounds moral and legal status at the level of individual capacity, whereas the aristocrat does it at the group level or the human species level in particular. But what both approaches share, again, is this valorization of rationality as the basis for full moral status, again, with all the racialized and gendered assumptions that and baggage that often run alongside that. And we can also see that both approaches often have similar intellectual genealogies, right? So Raphael cites two French Enlightenment philosophers who are relatively obscure in the Anglo-speaking world as representing the sort of forebears or originators of these approaches. But of course, different genealogical stories could be told, highlighting the common source of these two approaches. So for example, in the book, Raphael cites John Locke as influential within the aristocratic tradition. But Locke's conception of the person is also highly influential for thinkers presented as meritocrats like Jeff McMahon and Peter Singer. Again, Raphael also talks about Immanuel Kant as an influence within this aristocratic tradition. But again, we see the influence of someone like Kant on deontological meritocrats like Jeff McMahon. And for both Locke and Kant, the ideas of rationality and autonomy are central to their conceptions of personhood and moral status. And what's more, of course, both Locke and Kant are well known for their hierarchical views about the human species itself, especially relating to race and gender. So I think whilst Raphael's genealogy and typology of ideas is very sophisticated and very illuminating, I think there are also alternative genealogical stories that could have been told, right? And different ways the taxonomy of thought in the book could have been divided up, right? And these different stories could have yielded different conclusions to the ones Raphael arrived at. That's because Raphael seeks to locate a middle ground between the aristocratic and meritocratic approaches with the aim of achieving the best of both worlds. But if these approaches share similar problems, pursuing an entirely new approach rather than a middle ground may be the way to go. And Manisha already gestured at some alternative frameworks that could be an alternative starting point for thinking about expanding our conceptions of rights and legal protection to other species. Now, this is not to say that I don't think there are, I think there are good pragmatic reasons to advocate for a species membership approach to extend fundamental rights to animals. And I think Raffael makes some really powerful points in the book. And I think he's right that even a more inclusive sentientist approach, like Alistair Cochrane's, runs into some practical problems from a legal standpoint. Right. So, for example, there's a whole host of, I think, societal reasons to want to preserve the dignity of human patients in permanent vegetative states, or to treat the corpses of dead humans with respect, even if these humans aren't sentient. So I think there's a lot still to be said for the species membership approach that Raffael defends. What I'm not fully convinced of after reading the book is that drawing on the aristocratic tradition yields the purported benefit of preserving human equality. And I think to convince me of that would involve a sort of engagement with and refutation of some of the aforementioned insights from critical animal studies. But none of this is to detract from just what a wonderful book it is. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Joe, thank you very much, and thank you again to Manisha and Justin. Raffael, water in there, I hope.
That's right. There's a bit left, and I'll need it. Now, thanks so much, Manisha, Justin, and Joe, for these incredibly warm comments and really thought-provoking insights. I'll have to think about all of this much longer than I could now, listening to you, jotting down everything, and hopefully I'll be able to get back to you properly with some more refined answers. But I'll, just for the sake of the discussion, I'll try to provide some short answers, some first thoughts that I have really on your excellent comments. So, and thanks again very much for having taken the time for all of this. So, Manisha, on your point about, overdetermination, and it's something that Justin raised too. I think, yeah, to some extent, this is a consequence of the methodology I adopt, trying to construct an ideal type. And I do concede that, the thinkers that I invoke to illustrate the ideal type aren't necessarily pure instantiations of the ideal type. Now, it's true that I gave Singer as an example for a particularly good illustration of the meritocratic ideal type. But I think, as you've worked, showed in your comments, and it's come out too in Joe's comments about, what Singer does with personhood and the right to life in particular, it might actually show that he's not maybe that pure a meritocrat. But I think nonetheless, what characterizes his work is a commitment to what James Rachels has called, moral individualism. Now, it's true he has been willing to abandon it to some extent, when promoting, great ape rights, for instance, mostly on sort of political grounds, as I understand it. But his ethical framework is still very much one committed to moral individualism. And in that sense, I do think that it rejects the idea that we can say, African elephants deserve rights X, Y, and Z because they are members of that species. He would be opposed to that, at least on a moral perspective. But yeah, potentially he would be willing to include species considerations when it comes to politics. So maybe I wasn't being fair enough on that front. I take that point. So on your point about, excluding lower animals and that still, being a problem of my account, and, this ties in with what you say about, a potentially problematic Western starting point. Again, I think that's something where I can bite the bullet. I think I don't claim that my approach is ideal in the sense of, sort of utopian. The aim I have is a much humbler one, I suppose. I would like legal systems to be less arbitrary than they currently are. And I agree with you that even if jurisdictions are to adopt the SMA and grant rights and personhood to animals, we're still going to end up with some arbitrariness. Personally, I cannot see a way around it, at least in the near future, as much as I am sympathetic to perhaps the more radical or more inspirational model that you are proposing and other critical scholars are proposing too. So from that point of view, yes, I think I am more anchored in the Western tradition, not because I like it, but because I think that this is the starting point of a lot of jurisdictions around the world, for better or worse. Animal rights and human rights not being a zero-sum game, I think it's a really, really helpful point that, as Joe's comments showed, is something that resonated with him too. And I see where you're coming from. What I will say in response to this is that, yes, I don't think animal rights and human rights are necessarily a zero-sum game. For instance, they aren't on the meritocratic conception, nor are they necessarily on the species membership approach. But I think we are gonna find a conception like the aristocratic one helpful as long as we have people who take a meritocratic view, because it is, at least as I characterize it, antithetical to the aristocratic one. So perhaps as we move away from problematic meritocratic conceptions, we will no longer need to characterize human rights accounts as particularly aristocratic. Maybe there are more fruitful ways forward, maybe along the lines that Joe has suggested very helpfully. So this is very tentative thoughts. I realize I skated over a lot of your sophisticated sort of analysis there. Justin, just to say thank you very much for the kind words. And on the feasibility point, I take that one. I think it wasn't particularly doing a lot of work, potentially, pointing out that, judges would find it easier. I think you're absolutely right to say that very often it is the task of judges to look into the facts and the individuals. And as you say, I grant as much when I say that, there's defeasibility, right? So this possibility that the sort of species default can be defeated if it harms the individual animal. So say if an infant chimpanzee, say, would receive a right to bodily liberty, where in fact that would endanger them. So there a judge can defeat that, and it will require looking into the individual capacities of that being. So I very much, sort of take that point. What I would say in response to, and I think that's where there is still value in a group-based approach, be it species-based approach or other group-based category. The default, as I said, is there is equality in that sense. It is the rule, it is not the exception. Whereas if we abandon this notion and go down a fully meritocratic path, then there's no rule anymore. And you're again just going to be looking at a sort of stratified gradualist account. And then I think it does get problematic, and it might even cost the judges a bit more time, even if it's not the most compelling point. I take that one. Okay, so lastly, Joe, I think, yes, this is very, very helpful, and I'll have to think much more about what you said. So very tentatively here. So you're saying, there's an alternative way of thinking about this. And first, I agree with you. The aristocratic approach might not really preserve egalitarianism in practice. And it's something I was a bit sort of, I was quite conscious of actually, and wasn't entirely sure how to deal with. What I came up with, and maybe wasn't the most compelling way to go, is to say, to distinguish between theory and practice effectively. The practical issues with the aristocratic approach that you've pointed out and other scholars have pointed out, that it effectively is counterproductive and undermines equality, to me seems to be contingent on human psychology to quite some extent. And the arguments of aristocrats probably still have some purchase on a theoretical level. Now you can say, what's the use of theory if we're in a context where, we do deal with human psychology? For what it's worth, I would just sort of propose that a lot of people find these aristocratic arguments very compelling. So So I guess, yeah, maybe we can just, accept that and propose a species membership forward. Or you might say, no, we need a bolder approach, and we need to convince them that this aristocratic way of thinking is problematic in the first place, as Manisha Deka has argued so well in a recent article. And then lastly, perhaps, on the genealogy that I'm telling and on the way that I divide up the debate space, I am entirely on board with what you're saying. I do say as much in the introduction. I say, look, this isn't the only way of slicing up, the debate. Before this book, people have thought about it in other terms than aristocratic, meritocratic, and I'm sure after it, they will continue to do that too and come up with different models and ways of thinking and different histories too. And I think there's a lot of value in that. I don't want to crowd out any other, conceptions at all. But what I do hope is that this antithetical framing that I'm proposing sheds light on some of what's happening. Because really, sort of why I was struck by this debate that I read, the French Enlightenment one, is like, these arguments are really familiar. They're sometimes almost word to word the same, challenges to animal rights that we're still seeing today in, say the cantonal executive that I spoke about. So I was just interested in finding out, why is there such a similarity? What unites these views? And I came up with aristocratic versus meritocratic, but I'm sure that, clever people will come up with much better frameworks than this one. And then maybe just very lastly, I think you're right to say that there's a shared notion of rationality in the thinkers that you've pointed out. But I've also been thinking about other thinkers. If you take Francione, for instance, Cochrane, I'm not sure they share that same commitment to rationality. They focus much more on sentience, Francione in particular. Same on the human rights side. It's true, the thinkers that you flagged, they focus on rationality, and so do many others. There are others, though, who talk about language more, or culture, as sort of founding myths, as I call them, for human rights. So it may not actually capture all the aristocratic and meritocratic accounts. So hopefully there's some room left for my theory. But I'll leave it there, and just thanks again to all to all of you for your amazing comments. And I look forward to hearing if anyone else has questions or comments.